Hey, what's up guys, Chris here, and today we have an awesome tutorial course on how to do an epic slow motion Maz Flash. Let's take a look from our latest short film concept showcase, Tomb Raider Ascension. Boom! Now, I hope you guys enjoyed that slow motion gunshot showcase, as I think it works really well, and once you see it in a cinematic setting, it really pays off. Now, before we get started, we need to keep a few things in mind that will help us when it comes to post-production, because they have to do with how we film things. One of those things are the props themselves. Now, there's a full-fledged course on Guerrilla Filmmaker on everything that has to do with props. Now, in our specific case, this is an airsoft pistol. It takes gas in the bottom, and then this gas pushes the slide back and forth when you press the trigger. This is extremely important for, of course, realism reasons when you shoot anything that has to do with military-based props and action. More than that, because we're filming in slow motion, and specifically, we're going to be filming at 120 frames per second to slow it down considerably in post-production. When this move occurs, you will see the slider going back, opening up, and this will give us the opportunity to fire a shell out of our gun in slow motion and towards the lens as well. After that, it's all about setting up your scene from the character and what they're wearing to the lights and location, and of course, post-production, color grading, and scene grading. Now, all of these are covered from the various courses on Guerrilla Filmmaker. Speaking of which, I'm having an end of summer massive sale at 40% off for a limited time only. So guys, if you wanted to join and become a Guerrilla Filmmaker yourself and learn everything that I have in my book, from tips and tricks I developed over a decade on the field to everything that you need to know, from cameras or filming with a smartphone to visual effects to locations to post-production techniques, and on and on and on, Guerrilla Filmmaker is your one-stop platform to becoming a filmmaker. This massive 40% discount is going to be up for a limited time only. Please use the code you will find in the description to get the massive discount and join my crew. A ton more details can be found in the link below. So with that said, let's fire up After Effects and check out how to make an epic slow motion muzzle flash. Here we have our composition, guys, so let's take a look at the original footage. Now, when you record in slow motion, you usually have two options within a camera. One is that it records real time, but it has 120 frames to work with, and the other one is it actually slows it down with you with a playback of like 24 frames per second, and you already have the slow motion. So keep that in mind, guys. Depending on what you have, you may want to slow it down yourself manually, but let's say right-clicking, going to time stretch, and manually inputting the duration of slow motion. Or another thing you can do is you can select your footage over to your import and then interpret footage, then go to main, and then here, now this file is already 20 frames per second, but let's say it was 120, I'm gonna convert it back to 24, and that is gonna make it slow motion. Keep that in mind, guys. But if we have a playthrough here, we can see our clip playing through. Now, even though this is 120 frames per second, you can see it happens quite fast, but actually, for such a split eye blink motion is actually quite good. We can see that the gun slide plays through for quite a while, and that is going to give us the great chance to put a nice Maz Flash and slow motion bullet cell coming out and towards the lens. So the first thing that we can do is actually the the most challenging one, let's say, which is the bullet shell itself ejecting through. Now, the way you do this is I have here a pre-rendered asset which is called 45 cal slow motion. If I'm bringing it in and isolate it by itself, you can see what it is. It's basically a nice render of a shell playing through in time, but it kind of like, how do you call this? Like rotates on its own axis, but it stays put in place. And this is great because this is exactly what we need. So by bringing this asset in, now we can play with it. They kind of like put it in the right spot. We can kind of like rotate it to match things a little bit, scale it down and that sort of thing. But the most important thing and the trick to make this work is to actually convert this 2D pre-rendered layer essentially file to a 3D layer. The way you do this is you select your layer and you scroll over right here and you see this box. It's called 3D layer. If I turn this on, it turns it into a 3D layer, and that means parameter wise. It means I have Z-axis and I can push it in Z-space and things like this. Now, if you cannot see this, if you toggle the switch down here, it will come in. So what you do first is you turn into the 3D layer. And then you press P to bring up the position parameters of your layer. And now you have your, like left and right, up and down, but also your depth setting. So I'm pretty sure you guys can see where this is going. What we do now, if I de-isolate this, is we're going to bring it in and start playing with the parameters and place it in the correct spot that it makes sense in terms of scale and overall position. Then what we're going to do when we're happy with this is we're going to click the keyframe that saves the position parameters on that frame in time. If we then scroll through forwards for a few frames and let the action play through, now we know that, hey, I want to start bringing this out and towards the lens. So by me starting moving things around, playing with the Z space, playing with, the vertical, horizontal space, and kind of like trying to make this match where I want to go, you can see that the program automatically creates a second keyframe. And now we have an actual animation here, guys, as you can see. Now, it happens in a linear manner, meaning that our two keyframes occur between one another in a straight line. But if you guys focus, we have our straight line here, that kind of like light blue, and it has a few dots on it. If I click on that, we can actually create a curve. So instead of it happening in, in a straight linear manner, now the animation is going to happen like so. So not only does it happen in 3D space, but we also have full control of the motion of our bullet shell. Now, another advanced trick, and always something to keep in mind with visual effects that have motion, is to enable motion blur. The way you do this is you go back down here, and if you look this kind of like stacked circles thing, it says motion blur. If we enable that, you see exactly what happens now. Now our layer, because we've animated in terms of position, has motion blur enabled now. See, off and on. If we go closer to the lens, you can see the insane difference that makes. That is really cool because the program itself auto-calculates for you the realistic motion blur that your asset would have if that move actually happened in relation to a camera. And that is what makes this work really well. So that is the core methodology in achieving this effect. Now, in terms of where you can find assets, pre-rendered assets like this, there are a lot of websites like Action VFX, Make Big Films or Big Films, as well as the old school hero of all of this, Video Copilot, with Action Essentials from Andrew Kramer. Now that we've seen the basis of it, let's take it a little bit further. I'm going to isolate my footage and the 50 cal that we just taken a look at. Now, keep in mind, guys, in order to make this work, you, depending on your shot, you need to spend the time. If I press P back here to bring up the position, you see we did the exact same thing. When the slide goes back, we have a first position introduction of the cell. And then as we scroll through the timeline, we have this animated with our position and depth, as well as our curve, to curve through in space and go through and come towards us, right? This is all about spending the time adjusting your curve and what really fits to make it work. Play around up with the speed and overall position, and it's going to work out. Now, a last thing to keep in mind with those things is that when we introduce a new element within the scene, there's a very high probability almost all the time that the colors and the overall contrast do not fit as well. So what we need to keep in mind is to put a few coloring effects on our asset layer itself to better match with the environment that we actually filmed. For example here, if I turn off my 2 effects, you can see that our bullet shell, it's kind of like too yellow and too saturated in relation to the rest of our image because we filmed with a very high dynamic range as well as a flat profile to do color grading and scene grading in post-production. So one of the effects that I put on is called tint, and if you go to effects, color correction and select tint down here, this is essentially a black and white filter. But if you go to the amount, we can set it from, let's say 100%, which makes it black and white. We can turn it down to 50%, and that simply desaturates the existing colors of the layer. Then, if we go to lumetri color, again, this is effects, color correction, and lumetri. This is a great color grading tool to do a lot of adjustments, as well as import LUTs if you need to. But anyways, in this one, I'm just going to bring the blacks out a little bit and make them more washed out, just as our raw image appears. Once I do this and we play through, and remember guys, our motion blur is enabled, and that's why you see such a nice motion path. If I turn it off and on again, you can see what a massive difference that makes, and that applies to any visual effect layer you bring in that is pre-rendered and you want it to move in accordance to the image or the animation that you force it to do, and you want it to have motion blur. So guys, if I play this through now, we can see what we're working with. We just have a very cool shell ejection effect going on. The cool thing is that it comes towards the lens, and that makes it very impressive. Now, let's move on to the Maz Flash. We have 2 layers here, guys. One is the Maz Flash itself. Let's bring it in right here, and it happens like so. If I actually isolate just that one, this specific one is a great shout out to Action VFX. They have some great pre-rendered VFX assets as well as other goodies. This is one of the better ones that I've seen that is a Maz Flash that is in slow motion, right? So if we play through, you can see playing through, and that is great because usually Maz Flash literally happens for a split frame. So as we see here, guys, we bring in this asset, we start doing the exact same thing, right? If we bring up our footage, we're going to start bringing it in and place it when the action happens to the correct position that makes sense. Now, this one does not move because the gun moves slightly, but the Maz Flash does not move, right? So we don't need to worry about 3D space because we're not going to animate it or worry about its motion blur. We just need to place it in at the right position and let it play out. But of course, just like we did before, we need to put a few coloring effects to make it fit the scene a little bit more. Now, by coloring effects, it's more about visual artistic effects, and they have to do with one pink glow, as you can see here, guys, here. But my deep glow effect just gives energy to that fireball because by default, it sits a bit flat, and this is what you want, right? You want to have full control of these things in post-production. So the first thing I did is I put a glow effect. This is called Deep Glow and is a paid third plugin. The equivalent would be if you go to Effects and then Stylize and then hit Glow. But the issue I have with the baked-in glow effect, guys, here is that the maximum glow radius is 1000, you see? Which can still work. It's pretty cool. But many times I find myself wanting a bigger radius, which in this case it goes to 2000. You see, 1000 glow radius is quite good for 1080p or 10K clips and resolution workspace. But when you work with 4K, you need a bigger radius to spread that glow effect even further. But it's not an essential thing to have because the baked-in glow effect will do great here as well. I just want to show you guys my full post-production methodology and technique so you guys don't miss a single step. After that, we have a fast motion blur effect because if I zoom in here and I put this in full resolution, let it load for a second, you can see that our pre-rendered asset is very crisp. The problem with crisp VFX is that they stand out, right? Because of that, by going to Effects, Blur and Sharpen, and selecting Fast Box Blur, this is just easier on the program, and in this case, we don't really need a high fidelity motion blur effect. By turning this on and putting on something like 2, you can see that it takes a lot of the edge off. More than that, while this is a slow motion particle explosion in space essentially, it's still good to keep it a bit blurred because it still has motion and energy behind it. So if I turn this on and we zoom back out a bit and we turn it on and off, you can see the difference that we're starting to make in the assets we introduce. Let's bring it back a few more layers and see what we're working with. Now, if I go back out, you can see I have another layer here, an adjustment layer, and it is called Flash. The way you create new adjustment layers, you go Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. Once you create one, you can always right-click and rename it just so you know what you're working with when you come back to revisit the project. Now, what this layer does, guys, is if we go frame by frame here, and I select it, and we start having the Maz Flash come through right there. This is a simple layer that it has a curves effect by going to Effects, Color Correction, selecting curves, but we're not actually going to manipulate in any form of way. I just want to change the mode of the adjustment layer from nothing to add. Let's see what this does. As you can see, it simply brightens the whole scene and it introduces extra luminance. The reason why this is important is because when a light-based effect occurs on screen, it should affect the luminance of the whole image. Of course, it was not filmed, so it didn't do that on the day, but we need to still introduce some of that in post-production. Now, I hit T here by having my layer selected to bring up the opacity. And as you can see, what we did is we set it to 50%, hit our keyframe to introduce a keyframe right here, and then by scrolling through, we're going to bring it back down to 0. And what that does is it creates a flash that gradually fades out alongside the Maz Flash, and it's kind of like a cheap way to reintroduce some light illumination as our VFX asset takes place. Right there, guys. It's subtle, but trust me, guys, when it comes to visual effects, subtle things like this go a long way. What we have after that, guys, if I go right here and we bring this back in, is I have a Cinegrade layer, guys. Now, this is the overall color grade and Cinegrade kind of like cramped in into one layer. And of course, if you want to know all about my techniques when it comes to these very important steps to achieve a cinematic image, then make sure to check the Gorilla Filmmaker program, where just like in this tutorial, I take you step by step in the course of my technique, my methodology, and what effect I use to achieve the images that I do. So with that set in place now, we can see what we're working with. If we hit play, we're almost there, right? Boom, we have the Maz Flash, we have the bullet shell, and we have the overall illumination happening in space. But believe you me, we're not done then. I have 2 more effects that we can put in place to really put the cherry on top on this overall scene. And that is 2 effects. One I call inversion. If I go over here, guys, and I bring it up, it's literally an adjustment layer by going to layers, new adjustment layer. Then we cut it down to a single frame, right? By holding the beginning and the end, you can drag it back in and forth and make it a single frame. And then we go to effects. We go to channel, let's channel, and we hit invert. And what that does is literally inverts our image's luminance and colors. So reds turns to blue, blacks turn to white, white turns to black, and so forth. Now what that does is it introduces a very violent frame because it's just a quick flash. But it's not just a cheap white solid, you know, it's an actual inversion just to make it a bit more spiced up. If you think of kind of like welding steel and that flash happens, we want something as violent as that to happen in the image for a single frame. And that happens when the first occurrence of the Maz Flash occurs, just to give literally a big bang for a single frame. The reason why we place it on top of our color grade is because if we place it under, it's going to get affected by the color grading itself. And we don't want that because it's an inversion effect. You see the difference? If it's behind, under the layer of Cinegrade and color grade, everything just gets blown out. But if it's after, look at the softness of the inversion effect. That's why we place it on top. We let it happen for a single frame, and then this is the result. Boom. You see how much more violent that single frame of inversion has as an effect. Now, I use this method in many things, including explosions or sci-fi gun flares and all that sort of thing. Try it out, see what it does for you, and see if it elevates the effect. Lastly, we have a heat distortion layer. Again, same thing, guys. Layer, new adjustment layer, rename it so you know what it is. And now we have something called heat distortion. Heat distortion is one of my top 5 After Effects plugins that I actually take all of the Guerrilla Filmmaker members through my After Effects top 5 plugins and tricks, and this is one of them. And it has to do with introducing very, very advanced and realistic rendering of heat distortion and heat dissipation effects. The reason why those are important is because when you're dealing with things like energy bursts or fire or explosions, anything that would generate some form of shockwave and heat, this effect is great because it brings that in and elevates the image again. Now, the way I used it, by the way, it's heat distortion by Video Copilot. Highly, highly suggested, guys, if you want to know why, as well as some other amazing plugins for After Effects, make sure to check the Guerrilla Filmmaker program. Now, I go to Effects, Video Copilot, and it's right there, Heat Distortion. The thing that we need to do about this one is to actually introduce a mask to our layer. The way you do this is you go back up here to this rectangle tool, you scroll down, and then you select Ellipse tool. What you do then is you draw a mask, right? And you bring it in. Now, I drew this mask and I place it where the gun, Maz Flash, and overall gun direction is. Then I hit F on my keyboard and I feather it out by about 50 pixels. You can play around depending on your scene and what fits best. What that does is it just keeps the effect happening in this place and the displacement, and it just feathers it, feathers it out a bit gradually, so it's not a harsh kind of like stop to the effect. This is very important, guys, because this is where all the heat and energy dissipation and distortion and displacement happens. If we put it everywhere, it kind of doesn't make much sense why the hand itself will have distortion on it. So keep these small things in mind, guys, in terms of how we tackle something like this and the thinking and method behind it. Now, once we have the effect in, this is very easy. We change the noise part then to smoke. We changed the distortion amount to 5, hit amount to 10, hit bias to 0.10, but the important thing is to change the noise scale from something like 100 over to 500. It just spreads out and makes bigger the noise pattern where the displacement takes place. Lastly, we need to change the wind direction to the direction of the gunshot and change the speed to 3. This is important, guys, because by default the speed is on 1, and sometimes you need either a greater speed of displacement or a slower speed of displacement, and this is how you control that. Then we trim our layer back down to where we want it to start, and that is it. If I hit play now, you can see what we're working with. When this takes place alongside our whole cinematic sequence, as well as sound design, which of course, again, guys, I take you through my principles of sound designing in editing in the Gorilla Filmmaker program in order to create amazing and immersive sound design in the easiest possible way to bring shots like this to life. Let's take a final look. And that's it, guys. I've used the same technique in another test that I did a few weeks before I shot this one, actually. And I'm just going to share it with you as well, guys, because it's really the exact same thing, but with a rifle gun, but the exact same methodology, technique was applied to that one as well. Let's take a quick look at that one too. That was pretty cool, guys, and that is literally it. As you see, guys, once we start layering things up and building on top of our base, we can really create something that looks great and pays off the original idea and the narrative that we set through. Okay, guys, so that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial course and you learned something. And when you get the time, make sure to get out, film something really cool, and try out the slow motion Maz Flash effect. Don't forget the massive 40% discount on becoming a Gorilla Filmmaker. Link in the description below with all the information, including the discount code. With that said, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Until then, stay awesome and creative.